A large portion of the Jewish nation has returned to its homeland, but the heart, soul, and mind of much of the Jewish nation are still in exile mode. This state of affairs must and will inevitably change. This is Torah Nation TV from Jerusalem, and we are speaking with the head of Machon Shilo, Rabbi David Bar-Hayim. Shalom, Rabbi Bar-Hayim.
Shalom.
Is one obligated to eat Seuda Shelishit on Yom Tov?
In all the sources in which Chazal speak of eating shalosh seudot, 3 meals on Shabbat, we find that the language employed by Chazal speaks explicitly about Shabbat. In none of those sources, such as the Gemara and the Talmud Bavli, Masechet Shabbat Daf Kof Yod Zayin, does it mention Yom Tov. And therefore it would seem obvious that the answer is no, one does not need to eat Seuda Shlishit on Yom Tov. However, we find in the Tur, in Or HaHayim Siman Tov Chof Kaf Teif, the Tur writes, Rabbeinu Yaakov Bar Turim writes, V'yesh omerim, there are those who say, Shesarich la'asot bo shalosh seudot. There are those who say that with regards to Yom Tov, as with Shabbat, one is required to have 3 meals. He doesn't mention who these views or who these Chachamim are. V'chen katav Rambam zal, and this is also what the Rambam wrote, which we will discuss in a moment. And then he goes on to say, V'adoni avi harosh zal, and my father, my master the Rosh, lo nahar ken. This was not his practice. In other words, from what we hear from the Tur is that, according to the Tur, the Rambam is of the view that one must have shalosh seudot on Yom Tov as on Shabbat, but the view of the Rosh was not so. When we come to examine the language of Rambam in Ilchot Shabbat Perek Lamed Halachat Teith, we find as follows: Hayav Adam le'echol shalosh seudot b'Shabbat. The Rambam here also employs the explicit language of Chazal, speaking about 3 meals on Shabbat. He does not mention Yom Tov at this point. He goes on to say these 3 meals are to be eaten ahath arvit, 1 in the evening, ahath shaharit, 1 in the morning, ahath bamincha, and 1 in the latter part of the afternoon on Shabbat. And one has to be careful to perform this mitzvah of eating shalosh seudot, and one must not eat less than 3 meals on Shabbat. One can eat more, of course, but one is required to eat 3 meals at least on Shabbat. Even a poor person who is supported by the community charity fund, he too must eat 3 meals on the Shabbat, which means that the community, if they provide him with some charity in order to be able to buy what he needs for Shabbat for himself and his family, they must take into account the fact that he must have 3 meals on the Shabbat. If a person was ill or felt unwell because he had eaten so much previously, or because he is fasting on that day, we won't go into the reasons why a person might fast, but if a person is fasting on that day, on Shabbat, patur mishalosh seudot, he is then exempt from eating 3 meals on Shabbat. In other words, the purpose of the 3rd meal is to add kavod, to add as a special sign of hashivut, of importance of the Shabbat. It is in order to honor the Shabbat. But if a person finds it odious, difficult, and unpleasant to do this, to the point where it is really something which he enjoys not in the least bit at all, then he's patur, he's exempt. One has to drink wine at all of these 3 meals, says the Rambam. He doesn't say you have to make kiddush, but he does mention the need, and this is mentioned also in the Gemara, Masechet Berachot, and the Talmud Bavli Daf Mem Bet. There it is implied, this is the basis for what the Rambam says here, it is implied there that it is the custom of people to drink wine at all 3 meals on Shabbat, and to break bread on 2 separate pieces, or 2 separate pieces of bread, or 2 loaves of bread, or 2 pitot. And this also applies on Yamim Tovim. Those 3 words at the end of this halacha, v'chen b'yamim tovim, are the crux of our discussion. Because one can explain these words, v'chen b'yamim tovim, to refer to the entire halacha. In other words, that which was said from the beginning of this statement of the Rambam, namely, hayav adam le'echol shalosh seudot b'Shabbat, a person is required to eat 3 meals on Shabbat, and at the end he says, V'chein b'yamim tovim, this applies to that statement as well at the very beginning. In other words, at the end when he adds the words V'chein b'yamim tovim, he is referring back to the original statement at the beginning of that halakha, several lines before, in which case the Rambam is in fact saying that one must eat shalosh seudot on Yom Tov. But it's also possible to understand that one has to drink wine and have lehem mishneh, 2 loaves of bread or 2 pieces of bread, whole pieces of bread, like 2 rolls or 2 pitot at each of these meals on Shabbat. And v'chein b'yamim tovim, this also applies to Yom Tov. And here the Rambam means to say that one is required to have wine and to have lehem mishneh on Yom Tov at one's meal, but it does not mean to say that one has to have 3 meals on Yom Tov. He means to say that just as it is a requirement that when one eats a Shabbat meal there be wine and there be lehem mishneh, in the same way when one eats one's Yom Tov meal, there is a chova also to have wine and to have lehem mishneh, but not necessarily to have 3 meals. So this halakha can be read either way, I believe, quite reasonably, and therefore I do not believe there is any proof from the language of the Rambam that one is required to eat shalosh seudot on Yom Tov. Furthermore, we find no source amongst the Gaonim or other Rishonim who say plainly that one is required to eat shalosh seudot on Yom Tov. And this is perhaps a further reason, this in itself is not conclusive proof, but this is a further reason to assume that the Rambam also does not hold this position. If we're not forced to assume that the Rambam has a position which is different from all the other Chachamim, then we do not need to force ourselves into that position. I don't think myself that the Rambam was intended in his words at the end of this halakha, V'chein b'yamim tovim, I do not believe he intended to say that one is required to eat shalosh seudot b'yom tov. I think he was much more likely that he meant to say that just as one is required to have a special kind of meal which has wine and lehem mishneh on Shabbat, the same is true for Yom Tov. The fact that the Lashon, the language of the Rambam, is inconclusive is not perhaps such a surprise, and it is also something which is almost unavoidable when one writes, as the Rambam does, in such a concise and terse style. The advantage of such a style is that one can say a great deal in few words, and one can cover a lot of ground in a relatively short work, as the Rambam manages to do, and that's an amazing and stupendous achievement. On the other hand, when one writes so briefly and uses so few words to explain oneself, on occasion one runs the risk of being misunderstood or having one's meaning, one's intention not being very clear. And I think this is likely the case that we have before us, that the language of the Rambam is not conclusive. And the fact of the matter is that Beth Yosef, in his commentary on the Tur, also writes, when he mentions the Rambam, and he says that it's eno mukhrach bidvaro. In other words, the claim of the Tur, which is, well, the Tur is claiming that the Rambam holds this. The Rambam is obviously, the Tur understood the words at the end of this halakha, b'chein b'yamim tovim. He understood these words to refer to the entire halakha, including the concept of having 3 meals altogether on Shabbat, thus also on Yom Tov. This is how the Tur understand it. But the Beth Yosef says this is not mukhrach. In other words, one does not need to understand the Rambam in that fashion. One can understand it, as I suggested, that it refers to the latter statement only, which in some ways I think is a more reasonable reading. At any rate, it's certainly not less reasonable than the former reading. And therefore, the view of the Rambam on this issue, I think, cannot be clearly and definitively ascertained. The view of the Rosh, on the other hand, can be. We hear from the Tur very clearly that the Rosh's custom was not to eat shalosh seudot on Yom Tov. The fact that we do not find such an opinion that requires 3 meals on Yom Tov amongst other Rishonim would seem to imply that the view of almost all the Chachamim was such that one is not required to do so, and this also seems to fit, in my view, the meaning and the implication of the Rambam's language elsewhere. The Rambam writes in Ilchot Shabbat Perek Lamed Halakha Yod, the halakha after the previous halakha where he speaks of the requirement to eat shalosh seudoth, he writes that this is how one should conduct oneself on Shabbat. This is how one should spend one's day. He says, Kachu minhag tzadikim. This is the practice of the righteous. Yitparer adam b'Shabbat shaharit musaf. One davens in the morning, goes to shul. One davens shaharit musaf b'vet haKnesset. Uyavo leveitho, and then he comes home. Uyis'od seuda shniya. Please take note of the language. He says, Yis'od Seuda Shniya, and he is required, or he does take or perform the miswah of eating the second meal, because there is a miswah to have 3 meals, and now the meal he's having in the morning after davening is the performance of that miswah, of that requirement of eating the second meal. And then V'yalech lebeth hamidrash, and then he should go to the Beth Midrash after eating that second meal. Yikra v'yishma' ada minha, he should learn and study Torah till hamincha, which means till midway through the afternoon, which, as we've explained elsewhere, refers to the time of 9.5 hours of the day, which on an average day of 6 to 6, sunrise to sunset, is about 3:30. With palel minha, at that point he should daven minha. And then he goes home and he sits down and performs the miswah of Seuda Shelishit, of eating the third meal, during which he also partakes of wine. And he eats and drinks till the end of Shabbat, at which time he will daven Arvit and say Havdalah, etc. What I wish to stress is that the Rambam says that when one finishes davening in the morning, he says, you come home, and then you come home and partake of the second meal, because there's also a third meal coming up, which he mentions later after minha. Here the Rambam specifically in this halakha, when he describes one's timetable, the way one spends one's day on a Shabbat, how one should and is recommended that one spends one's day, he speaks about the morning being the second meal and after the afternoon the third meal. This is in Hilchot Shabbat. When one compares Rambam's lashon, Rambam's expression and language in Hilchot Shabbat to what he writes in Hilchot Shevitat Yom Tov Perek Wav Halacha Yod Teth, I think we can see quite simply and plainly a difference, and I think this difference is quite deliberate. So even though I said before that the style of the Rambam, the terse and concise style of the Rambam, can occasionally lead to his words being less than 100% clear and unambiguous, nevertheless, if one is very precise in one's reading of the Rambam, I think that we can find a basis for what I'm suggesting, that the Rambam's view is not as Rabbeinu Yaakov Baal HaTurim suggests, that one must eat a third meal on Yom Tov, but rather that one is not required to do so. What does the Rambam write? He says as follows. This is how one should behave on Yom Tov, he says. Kachi adath. Baboker mashkimim kol ha'am. Everyone should get up, all the people. Levatei knesiot, levatei midrash. Everyone goes to shul, to the Beit Midrash. Umit palalim. Wekoreim b'Torah. Be'inyan hayom. Everyone goes to shul and davens and hears the Torah read. Wehozrim levatehem ve'ochalim. And then they go home. Ve'ochalim, and they eat. You will note the Rambam doesn't say so'adim Seuda Shniya, because there is no Seuda Shniya, because there's no Seuda Shelishit. People go home and eat in the morning on Yom Tov for the very simple reason that they're hungry, and it's perfectly normal and reasonable to do so, and that is what one should do. One is not allowed, in fact, to fast till midday on a Shabbat or a Yom Tov, and therefore one does go home after eating, and one does eat, but not because there is a requirement to have a second meal followed later by a third meal. One does so because it's a Yom Tov, and one doesn't go hungry on a Yom Tov, and people are hungry and they want to eat. But the Rambam doesn't use the term Seuda Shniya because there is no Seuda Shniya. He says Ochlim because that is the reality, that is Orahad the Milatha, that is the way of the world. That is how things work. Following that you go to the Beit Midrash, just as he said regarding Shabbat. Korim Ushonim al Hasiyayom, and then he says you study Torah till the middle of the day, as opposed to Shabbat when he spoke about doing so till mid-afternoon. وَأَحَارْ حَصِّيَ يَوْمٍ, and after midday, مِتْپَرَلِمْ تَفِلَاثَ مِنْخَا, you daven mincha early in this case. According to the Rambam on Yom Tov, you can daven mincha earlier after shesh or hesi sha'ot, after 6.5 hours, minha gedola, which is not normally the case, because there is a miswah to have a big meal on Yom Tov during the day, not 3 meals, but have a big special meal on Yom Tov, which also needs to be prepared and can be prepared on Yom Tov. In other words, bread can be baked, an animal can be slaughtered, fresh meat can be procured and cooked and prepared, etc. And this takes time. So one has to allow time for all of this. Therefore, one studies till midday, davens mincha, v'hozrim levatehem, then they go home, le'echol v'lishtoth sha'ar hayom im halayla. And then they go home and eat and drink and celebrate Yom Tov until the evening. In other words, what we see in the Rambam's language is, if we do wish to read very carefully and precisely and take note of every word in the Rambam does not speak, with regards to Yom Tov, he does not speak about a Seuda Sheniya and a Seuda Shelishit. He says that one comes home and eats because, again, that is the way of the world, that is normal, that is how it must be, in fact, in order not to fast till midday, but not because there's a miswah of having 3 meals. There is a difference between these two statements, therefore. The one in Hilchot Shabbat speaks about coming home and being so'ed, a Seuda Sheniya, implying that there is a miswah to do so specifically because there has to be also a 3rd meal. So now there has to be a 2nd meal, and then later a 3rd meal. But these usages, these languages of Seuda Sheniya, Seuda Shelishit, etc., we do not find in the Chot Yom Tov. And I think this provides at least some support for the 2nd reading, which is also the Beit Yosef's reading of the Rambam, that there is no requirement to have a Seuda Shlishit Yom Tov, as was the opinion of the Rosh, and as far as I can tell, this was the opinion of all the Rishonim.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.